Okay, shalom aleichem, everybody. I want to talk about a Shailah that has a seasonal connection. It has a Purim connection, but I really want to open with like a incredible, unbelievable story, and we'll frame the Shailah with this. This is a story that the Talmidim of Lublini Yeshiva, the Lublina Ilim, the alumni of Lublini Yeshiva, would say over. It seems Reb Meir Shapiro, when he was appointed as the Rav of Lublin, um, he got invited by the Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe, who had a tremendous collection of svarim and memorabilia, all sorts of interesting artifacts, to peruse the ancient Pincus book of Lublina Kehila. It seems that an old uh, Pincus booklet had fallen into the possession of the Imre Emes, somewhere along the line. It contained items dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way to the Tkuf of the Marshal in the 1500s. And the Imre Emes invited him to review it because he was going to become Lublina Rav. And in there, Rebbe Shapiro found an incredible story that he would retell to his Talmidim to prove and elucidate various points. That story was later told over by many of his Talmidim, and there's a few different versions of it that were, promulgated amongst the different factions. But I want to say over the version that I came across, and the Shailah that arises from it, and we'll get to the Purim connection. So, as follows: Ma'aseh Shehaya Kachaya. There was a young couple that lived in Lublin in the mid 1500s. They were a happy couple. They came from successful families. They settled down together, and unfortunately, the union was not able to produce any children. Over time, the union became a sad union. They were hoping to produce children, it wasn't happening, and the woman, the wife of the house, slipped into some kind of depression, and she appeared to be ill. Now, they presumed originally that this was a temporary thing, and she'd snap out of it and get back to life. But alas, this was not to be, and it soon became clear that this was her final illness. She wasn't gonna, get out of this bed. She obviously had a terrible, fatal illness, and she was gonna die. Now, laying on her deathbed, thinking about her short life, and thinking about the fact that she's gonna pass on and leaving nothing behind, a husband who was gonna be an eligible bachelor would move on and marry someone else quickly in her stead. She's leaving behind no children. She was consumed with her lack of legacy and the fact that she wasn't, leaving over anything. Now, possibly in a moment of selfishness or of desperation, she calls her husband into the room and she says, "Listen, Moshe, I'm begging you, please, I need a favor from you." And he, willing to do anything to comfort his dying wife, says, "Sure, whatever it is that you need, I'm happy to do for you." And she blurts out, she says, "Moshe, I need you to promise me that you're not going to marry anybody else after I die." And he's like a deer in headlights. He's caught. He's not sure what to say. And he just, without thinking it through, he just agrees and he says, okay, whatever you need, whatever it is that you need, I won't marry anybody else. Shortly thereafter, I guess comforted and sated with the knowledge that she's leaving behind a legacy, there's going to be a husband who will live a long time and will always be known as the former husband of such and such a woman, because he's not going to be married to anybody else. She passes on to the next world and she dies. Now, this man, he buries his young wife, which is sad enough on its own. And after that, he goes home and he falls into like a kind of a deeper depression. As his new reality sets in, he realizes that come what may, he's going to be a bachelor. He begins to fall into depression. He's bemoaning his life. Now, word of this sad situation makes its way to the Marshal, who's the Rav of the town of Lublin, the Rav of the city of Lublin. And the Marshal summons the single man in to come talk to him. It seems the Marshal had a relationship with him. He summons the single man and he says, "I want to talk to you." The young man comes into the Marshal and he says, Marshal asks him, "No, what's bothering you? What is the story that happened?" The young man tells the Marshal, "Kach v'kach HaMeisim, I made a shvua. It was foolish, but now I'm stuck. I promised her. What could I do?" The Marshal says, let me be mine. Come back to me in the morning." Marshal goes to his study, and the single man goes home to his house. The Marshal burns the midnight oil, and in the morning, when the single man comes back with Moshe, the Marshal hands him a page-long tshuva, where he proves conclusively that Moshe is allowed to marry somebody else. It's a nishba levatalis hamitzvahs. The shvua doesn't have teeth, and Moshe could go on and get married. And he tells Moshe, this is my psak. I stand by it. Not kedekach. I'd be happy to be your Masada Kedushin, when the time comes for you to get married. Now Moshe quickly runs to Shatchan's meeting and he tells them he's ready, and he's an eligible bachelor. He's a good young man on the market, and they quickly find him a suitable mate. Moshe gets married. Everybody's happy for him. This is the happy ending that he was always denied, that he was looking for. And Nechama has come to him now that he's able to get married again after losing his young wife. Now, shortly thereafter, a few months later, Moshe is at home with his young wife. They're eating supper together. Moshe has a massive heart attack and he dies right there by the table. Now, the rumors in the town start moving. Everybody starts saying, obviously, the Marshal made an error. He paskined wrongly, and because this Moshe violated, a shvua, is why he was punished with an early death. This comes to the Marshal's attention. The Marshal instructs them. He says, conduct a regular levaya for this person. I'm going to come to the levaya. Nobody should judge him. He didn't do anything wrong. I stand by my psak. Marshal comes to the levaya, and before they conduct a spade, and they dig a hole, they put him in the ground, and before they're about to put the dirt to cover up Moshe, the Marshal says, everybody clear it, everybody go home. Give me a minute over here. Don't cover him up. And the Marshal takes out a small note. He opens up Moshe's clenched fist. He puts it inside there, and he walks out of the Beis HaKvaros. A few hours later, a few short hours later, the townsfolk are milling about, and suddenly Moshe, dressed in tachrichim, with some sand matted into his hair, wanders onto the streets of Lublin and shows his face. The women, the children go screaming and crying in every direction. It's a dead man walking. It's a zombie over here. But some of the men muster the courage up and they go and they ask him, they say, Moshe, is that you? How could you be here? Didn't you die? We buried you. And he says, no, you buried me, but I didn't die, and I'll tell you what happened. And he pulls out of his pocket the little note that the Marshal had handed him, and he reads it for them, and it goes as follows. It says, L'chvoid Bezdin Shomala, in honor of the Bezdin Shomala, Heyais sheyedatem, Shetayr lab bashamayim. Certainly you're aware of the halachic percept that Torah is not dictated by heavenly psak, and it's dictated by the Paiskim down here. V'ani pasakti, that this person's allowed to get married again. V'hineni geyser aleichem, I'm geyser on you, the Bezdin Shomala, Shetachzir Yisrael l'chayim. You should return this Moshe back to life, because he was allowed to do this. Signed, Yididchem Shleima Luria. Signed off the Marshal. Now he shows this zettel to the people, and everyone's blown away. It's a meifis. The Marshal did keep it aim. He brought this man back to life. It's incredible. It's amazing. But the people in the town are not willing to get close to a person who was just dead a few hours ago. His new wife runs out of the house. She won't be with him. Nobody's comfortable with interacting with this former dead person. Now, the Marshal goes into his study and he engages in deep tefillah, and he davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be geyser on the Malach who's in charge of Shikha, that the Lublina Olim should forget this, and they should not treat Moshe like he was dead, and Kachava, that the Lublina Olim forgot that Moshe had been dead, and everybody went back to Olim Kimin Nog. Now, and they said in Lublin, Gadol Nesa Achron Nesa Rishon, the ness of getting everybody to forget is bigger than the ness of Techiyas HaMeisim. Now, Vestim Efregan, how do we know the story? So the Marshal supposedly wrote down the story in his Pinkest book, and this is the Pinkest book that made it to Rameir Shapiro, who later told it over to his Talmidim, who told it over to others. Now, who was this Talmud? Nobody really knows, but there is a theory I saw in a sefer that the Psheversky Rebbe suggested that the Mechaber, the Mata Moshe, who the Mishabura quotes all the time, one of the Gedolei HaPoskim, who was a Talmud of the Marshal, maybe he's the one who the Marshal brought back to life. And the reason for this is that the Mata Moshe was referred to as a Moshe Mess. Now, it's not clear what the spelling of mess was supposed to be. It's possible that the spelling of mess was supposed to be Memai and Samach Samach. Maybe it's a German word. Maybe mess is an acronym for Machzike Torah or Marbitze Torah, these type of things. But it's also possible, and this the Psheversky Rebbe suggests, that Moshe was called Moshe Mess because he was this dead person that the Marshal was able to bring back to life. Now, this story is a marvelous story. It's an incredible story. Putting the story aside, there's a Shailah that arises from it, and the Shailah really has Purim context as well. And it's a Shailah that what is the halachic status of this man who came back to life? Meaning, is he still Moshe in his original iteration? Is he mutter to his wife? Do his nechasim belong to him? There's many nafkaminas to the Shailah, meaning how do we look at him, a guy who comes back to life like this? Now, the truth is that there's a famous Gemara that relates to Purim that discusses something similar, and I want to start with that Gemara and the place that discuss it, and then we'll move on to other things. Now, the Gemara in Megillah is a famous Gemara. The Gemara in Megillah in the Zayin and Beis tells of a story between Rabba and Rav Zera. It's a famous Gemara. The Gemara says, "I'll just pull it up." The Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, Rabbi Rav Zera have a mechalfi sudasayu. They would do their It says as follows: Rabbi Rav Zera Avdi Sudas Purim Mahadei Adadi. They would make their Sudas Purim together with each other. They would take turns. Ivsim, they got drunk. Come Rava got up. Shachted Rav Zera, he shechted Rav Zera. Lamachar in the morning, Boy Rachme, he davened for him. He asked Rachmanis v'Achai, he brought him back to life. Lashana the next year, Amalei Nesi Mar v'Nevet Sudas Purim Mahadei. Rabba invited Rav Zera back to him. He said, "Come do Purim Sudas with me again." Amalei, I can't be samech every year that an S is going to happen. To me. Now, there's many ways to learn this Gemara. If it means literal, if it means figurative, if the Gemara means to prove something regarding the halachas of getting drunk or not. And there's actually a whole sefer called Kam Rabbi Shachtel Zeir from Mordechai Tzion, a favorite mechaber of mine. He writes the very funny, humorous svarim. He has a whole sefer that collects all the different variables in this Gemara. But the real shailah that arises from this Gemara is, what is the status of Rav Zera once he was brought back to life? The truth is that this is not the only time that a story of Techiyas HaMeisim and a Shailah because of Techiyas HaMeisim arises. Throughout the Nevi'im and Chazal, there are many different circumstances and Gemaras that discuss what appears to be cases of Techiyas HaMeisim, or similarly cases of live people going places where the dead usually go. And there are shailas that arise from it, but the Gemaras and the Psukim don't make any mention of what it is that we're discussing. For example, the Psukim and Malachim Aleph Perik Yud Zayin, Malachim Beis Perik Daled, and Malachim Beis Perik Yud Gimel describe the lifetime of Elisha and Elio and the Techiyas HaMeisim that they did. This Gemara in Megillah that we mentioned is a famous case, but there's also Gemaras from Bava Kama Daf Chaf Yud Zayin and Ksubas Daf Samach Beis and Psachim Daf Nun that discuss different stories of Tanoim and Amiraim engaging in Techiyas HaMeisim one way or the other. Now, there's a bakanta thing that the Welt says. I don't know who the first one to say it is, but the Welt says that anyone who's musker in the Gemara is shaykh to Techiyas HaMeisim. And the truth is that it's come out of Mefarshei Gemara. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah, and the Figurim and Beis, tells a story of Chanina Bar Chama with the slave of Antoninus, and Antoninus tells Rebbe, Yadana Zuti di Ispachu Mechayim Mesim. I know that even the smallest amongst you are able to be Mechayim Mesim. Now, how exactly this Techiyas HaMeisim works, and what the mechanics of it is, and whatever, is things that are not so specific. Now, what's interesting is, before we handle the Shailah of Ishos that has to do with this cases, there's another interesting question: is there a bracha to make on someone who comes back to life? Now, I read in a sefer that when Rabbi Yaakov Edelstein was ill, so he did surgery, and I think there was a 6-minute period when his heart wasn't working, and they were working to bring him back, and they were able to bring him back. They brought him back to life. And when Rebbeinu Povarsky went to visit his old friend, Rabbi Yaakov Edelstein, who was recovering from the ailment, Rebbeinu Povarsky met him, and he made a bracha on him, Baruch Atah Hashem Chayim Mesim, with Shem Malchus, I believe. Now, this evoked a particular tumult amongst the Olam HaTorah. Is this bracha something that you're actually supposed to make? You're not supposed to make it. And I think they asked Nissen Karelitz, and Nissen Karelitz said that there's no makar for making such a bracha on someone who had Techiyas HaMeisim. The only makar is by someone who was ill and got better, but not for someone who actually died and came back to life. They asked Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and Rav Chaim said that it needs iyun, as to if there's makam to make such a bracha or not. Now, what's interesting is that I came across that Rav Chaim Vital in Sha'ar Gilgulim in the end of Akdam Lamed Ches brings a long story over there, how he fell into danger and basically died. And he writes, if you read it, it seems like that's what he's saying, that he died. And the Arizal came and did like the stories of Elisha and Elio and some Pal Piv and Yadai Al Yadai and brought him back to life. And when the Arizal brought Chaim Vital back to life, he made the bracha of Mechayim Mesim on him. So you see there's some sort of makar, albeit not brought down in Shulchan Aruch, but there's some sort of makar that a person who dies and comes back to life, makes this bracha. I don't know if it's the halacha, it's not la halacha, but it's an interesting makar of sorts for this din. Now, let's go back to our shayla, the question that we were discussing on the status of someone who comes back to life, on the status of their ishus. If the kedushin still stands, they need another kedushin. Now, there is like a setting the table type of shayla, and it's not directly miyashiv what we're discussing, but it is a bakanta shayla, or B'chanan has a shtickle about it in Chelik Beis. But it's a famous tshuva from the Trumas Hadashin in the Chelik of the Psachim Tshuvas, in Simukov Bays. It's a famous Shailah, and I just want to read it basically in its entirety, and it sets the table for what we're discussing, even if it doesn't mamish conclusively resolve the question. Trumas Hadeshen brings the Shailah as follows. It says, Eishes Eliyahu Hanavi, the wife of Eliyahu Hanavi. Now we know from the Psukim in Malachim that Eliyahu Hanavi rose to the heavens while he was still alive, right? The Psukim tell us of Eliyahu and Elisha walking on that last walk, and Eliyahu gets subsumed by the Richvei Eish that bring him to Shemayim, and Elisha cries out, Avi, Avi, Rabbi, 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 Rechav Yisrael Parashav. And it's a very poignant moment in the transition of leadership from Elisha to Eliyahu. And it highlights, the potency of Eliyahu Navi and the relationship with Elisha, and Ayin Sham for a discussion about that in its proper time and place. But Akaban the Shailah is Eliyahu, who seemingly went up to Shemayim when he was alive. What's the status of his wife? So the Trumas Hadeshen says as follows: Eishes Eliyahu Navi Eishes Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Michalni Nasi Leshacher. The Gemara in Ksubis famously tells us of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, who fooled the Malach HaMaves and was able to go into Gan Eden alive. So these are two circumstances of people in similar situations who seemingly went to the Olam Emes alive. So the question would be, are their wives permitted? Do they need gittin? Are they considered like the husbands died? And the Trumas Hadeshen says, Nafkamina l'dairis gamkein im yiske echad k'mayhem. Nafkamina would be, if somebody else would do this in later dairis, what would be the status? Now, many of the later Achronim bring a proof. This is one of the Shuvas that they bring a proof that Trumas Hadeshen did not receive all of his shilas, and he would write some of them on his own, l'chidude, like to because they were interesting, and he wanted to discuss interesting topics. Like potentially there are similar mechabim today, like if it's Zilberstein or others who probably don't receive all of the shilas that they say over and are writing some of them on their own. Now this, about the Trumas Hadeshen, the Taz himself in Hilchas Nida, I believe, brings this, that the Trumas Hadeshen didn't write all his own shilas. Although later on they discovered when the Leket Yesha was published, which is the Trumas Hadeshen's Talmud, many of the shilas that the Trumas Hadeshen discusses, he certainly did receive as shilas, in the Leket Yesha you have background sometimes, who it is and what the context was and whatever. But l'chayr, what the Taz means is that not every single one of the shilas that Trumas Hadeshen was writing were actually received questions, and some of them were l'chidude ba'alma, and probably this goes into that basket of Trumas Hadeshen questions that he wrote on his own as an interesting question. He brings this shilah of Eishes Eliyahu of Eishes B'Shuv Levi. And he says as follows. He says, who of the Kay Eliyahu B'Sakaris, but Mitzia Kofidal, Mashma Ktas Le'Eser, it's Mashma the Eliyahu still had dinim of a man. Then, Timani Tuvalama Tarachta Lishal Shailah Kazais. Now this is fascinating because I didn't even notice this when I said this, but I just said this was a tshuva he wrote on his own. You see over here that he's writing it a person. He writes, Timati Tuva Lama Tarachta Lishal Shailah Kazais. Why would you ask me the Shailah? So unless that's just like a literary flourish, I don't know. I recruit. I don't know. He says these are tinoikis and nida. The yud beis dvarim shalu anshe Alexandria Yeshua ben Chananya. The Gemara Nida in the Fayan Beis brings a conversation that the anshe Alexandria, the wise men of Alexandria, asked of Yeshua ben Chananya. The Gemara breaks up the questions that they asked into different categories. The Gemara says that three of them, behen shleisha dvarim divrei beiris. Three of the questions that these Chacham Alexandria asked of Yeshua ben Chananya were shtusim. They were silly questions. And one of them was Ishte Shaloit Malash at the time, and the Netziv Melach that the wife of Lot turned into, the pillar of salt that she turned into. Is that Matama Tumas Mesim? And Ben Ashunamis, the son of the Shunamis who was brought back to life, Mao Sheitama Mesim Lasad Love. Is he Matama Mesim Lasad Love? Meaning, is he considered like a walking dead person? That's Matama Mesim or not? Upashta Lahan, Mace Matama, Vein Netziv Melach Matama. And the answer that they gave was no, only a Mace is Matama, Netziv Melach is not Matama. Mace Matama, Vein Achayim Matama. The alive are not Matama. It says, Shalit Mesa, she certainly died. El Shenefcha Leguf Acher, Ben Shanamasa Mesa, Lechazav Yechi. It says, Vaisa is the cheshbon of the Gemara Nida was that since, even though, of course, these people went through some kind of death, but since they either returned back to life or they turned into a Guf Acher, they're considered something new and they're not considered dead. If he wants to bring a raya that Vaisa says the wives of Rishu Balevi, the wives of Eliyahu Navi, should not be also because only a man's wife is also, only a human's wife, and not someone who became a davar that's kule ruchni. And more or less, this is the end of the tshuva. Now, in here, in the words of the Trumas Hadeshen, l'chayra lies a little bit of a havana as to how to look at these people who came back to life. The way the Trumas Hadeshen seems to be saying it is the Ben Hashanah Sayamesa l'chazav hayechi, which means it undermines his deadness. There's something about death that requires finality. Deadness requires that you're not coming back to life. Techiyas HaMeisim will happen when it happens, and that will be a supernatural phenomenon when it does. But someone who comes back to life, meaning that seemingly that seems to imply some sort of thing that he's not really as dead as we presumed. That it's some sort of like quasi deadness, and he's not really as dead as we presumed, and therefore he's not Matam Mason. Now, if we extrapolate that to our question, perhaps you could suggest that someone who dies and comes back to life is not, his wife is still going to be usher, his wife's still going to be married to him, and nobody else is allowed to marry her, because if he came back to life, Vice says he's not mamish dead. Now, granted, that's not a conclusive raya, and yesh makom l'tzakech, and yaveh abal din lach, like, there's makom to be chaylik. Now, what I want to share is something from Simon Yud Zayin and Ebenezer, where this is discussed seemingly even more explicitly. Now, there's two Makairis that discuss it. There's a Birkei Yosef and there's a Knesset Agdala. The Birkei Yosef is in the beginning of Simon Yud Zayin. He has the Shailah as follows. He wants to know. I'm just not sure if that's related to thought. Maybe let's start with the Ber Heitev. The Ber Heitev in Even HaEzer Simon Yud Zayin Simchat Hanal brings from the Knesset Agdala that says as follows: In Mesa Isha Tachas Ba'il Lemisa Vadayis. A woman dies under her husband, the Vade death. V'shov Chaisa Yidei Navi. K'may Eliyahu leben Atzarfatis. V'Elisha leben Ashanamis. Like Paka Zika Sabal Me'alev. Ve'eni Yechol Li Nasa La'achar. Her husband's connection, his marriage connection to her, doesn't go away, and she's not allowed to marry someone else. And he says there's a raya from the Gemara with the wife of Chanin Bar Chachinoi. Now, what's he referring to? There's a Gemara in Ktubas and the Samach Bezim Beis that says as follows. It says of Chanin Bar Chachinoi have a Azl Bei Rav. He would go learn in the yeshiva for a long time. Azl Yosef Trey Sari Shni. He went for 12 years in the Bei Rav. Ad the Asi. The streets changed. He didn't know how to get home anymore. He went and sat by the banks of the river. He heard this young girl. They were calling him Bas Chachinoi, Bas Chachinoi. So Amar Shmami Nahar Ravisa Didan. Vice says, that's my daughter. Azal Basra, he followed her. His wife was sitting at home and she was kneading the bread. She looked up, she picked up her eyes. Chazisa Savi Liba. Chazisa, she saw him. So Savi Liba, she became joyful. Parach Rucha, and she had a heart attack and she died. Amar Lefanov, he said in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rebbeinu Shalom, Ani Yezu, this poor woman, Zes Chara, she waited so patiently for her husband who was sitting and learning all these years, and this is her schar. He davened for her and he brought her back to life. And the mashmayis of the Gemara is that there's no din that that he needed any sort of kedushin, any sort of thing. It was mashma that he was able to go back home, and everything went back to normal right away on its own. So you see seemingly that even though there's a Techiyas HaMeisim that transpired over here, it doesn't make it that she needs a new kedushin, that she's not mutat l'bayla, and she goes right back home to being mutat l'bayla. That seems to be the implication of Yana Gemara. Now there is a Birkei Yosef in the beginning of Simon Yud Zayin that also discusses this, I guess, like in his own way, more thoroughly. So the Birkei Yosef is in the beginning of Simon Yud Zayin and Even HaEzer. The Pesach Tshuva brings it down, but the Birkei Yosef himself is look upable, and he says as follows. He says as follows: Yesh li stapik be'eshes Rav Zera. He's the one who goes back to the Gemara and Megillah that we opened up with over here, and he wants to know, in the case of Rav Zera, Ki nishchat baila, her husband was shechted umeis, and he died. He's learning the Gemara, Kipshutei, face value, Rabba shechted Rav Zera actually died, and it was a day later that he was brought back to life. He says, Vadai paki kedushin v'hotul l'shok. Tzad number one is that for sure the kedushin was paka, and she was motul l'shok. V'chichaya l'macher Rav Zera, it's arach l'kadosh lish, the kedushin chadashim de pnuyihi. And when Rav Zera came back to life, he would have to mekadosh his wife again. She's a regular pnuya. V'dami l'machzeg ushasei the bay kedushin chadashim, the kedushin kam and nadadu holchu beget upanim chadashis ba'olakan. Just like by a get, the kedushin rishayim totally is dissipated, and you need a brand new kedushin over here. So to by misas habal, where the Mishnah says the isha yotze beget misas habal, those are equally effective methods of being mevatel kedushin. You'd need a brand new kedushin over here. It's a brand new thing. That's stat number one. The Birkei says. Dilma, he says, this that a woman is calling herself Mrs. Abal. Dafka when a person dies and remains dead. Reminiscent a little bit of the Trumas Hadeshin's Verte. Like Misa requires a certain finality. And that's an interesting word. When he wasn't buried, which I'm not sure if there's something to make of that Nikvar, Kvura itself is a culmination of that. And Api Kabbalah, maybe, the Neshama doesn't fully separate from the Guf on some level until after Kvura. again, maybe above my pay grade, but he does say over here, when there's no kvura v'chaya yedei navi, and I know that in some of the versions of the Marshal story that we started off with, it specifies particularly, the Marshal said not to put the sand on, not to finish burying the person. So maybe that was for practical purposes, so the guy could get out of the grave easier, but maybe there's also something to this. And Vice says, Yana Misa that transpired here was not a Misa like everybody deals with, but like Paki Kedushin Kamay, and the Kedushin Kamay didn't really go away. His regulation is like Tafsi Kedushin the Inish Achir the Alma, Ubaila Kashachai Mutter Bamiyad Kashahoy Lefnei Moise. And no one else's Kedushin would be able to be typhus, and her husband would be mutter to her just like he was previously. Now, the Birkei Yosef brings a raya from Yerushalmi. He brings an interesting raya from the Yerushalmi that says as follows. It says a person who made a T'nai. It's Yerushalmi in Parak Misha Achsa and Halacha Gimel. It says a person who made a T'nai. He says, he gives a get al T'nai, and he says, if it's the get should be chal from now, if I don't come at Yud Beis Chodesh. And he dies during that Zman. So the Shailah the Gemara wants to know, is Shimu Teres Nasi? He's not going to come, right? He's dead. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I think it's Rabbi Yehuda, could be wrong. Asurli nase. Why? Ani aimer nasele nisim v'chayim. Maybe the guy came back to life and he's brought back to life. So says the Chidah from the Yerushalmi, you see from the Yerushalmi that if he would come back to life, she would still be agidat to him, she would still be married to him. And therefore you see that the chash is that maybe he came back to life and she's still agidat to him. That's what the Birkei Yosef wants to suggest. Now I saw that Achronim ask, and this is L'chayr Navi's kasha, is that the Yerushalmi is talking about Mehilchas Kiyam T'nai. When you make a T'nai in Loi Basi Ad Yud Beis Chodesh, even if there's Kilu, the Yerushalmi is addressing the tiny tzad that he came back to life, there's not going to be a Kiyam of the T'nai. He might come Ad Yud Beis Chodesh. It's not a raya to the fact that someone who comes back to life, his Kedushin is not batal ba'atzim. That's not what the Yerushalmi is talking about. The Yerushalmi is talking about in Ilchas Kiyam T'nai Haget, if this is considered a Kiyam T'nai. So the raya that the Chidah is bringing, the Birkei Yosef is bringing, is an interesting raya, a creative raya, but an interesting raya, maybe not so conclusive. Now, what I did see, and maybe this is an interesting raya, is there's some sefer in a tshuva where he's discussing something different, and he makes a point regarding the story of Rabba and Rav Zera that I think maybe is relevant to us. He brings that there's a Gemara in the end of Shabbos on Daf Kuf and Vav when it's talking about all the mazalas, and when a person's born under a particular mazal, it imbues in him certain character traits, certain personality, and there's nafkaminas as to what he should try to do with his life. So the Gemara says, "Hai man de b'madim yehei gaver ashad dama." Someone who's born during mazal madim will be a person who's a bloody person. I'm a rabbi. Rabbi says, "I know b'madim avoy." I was born in Madim, and I'm a good guy. Abai says, "No, mar nami anish v'katul." You also, Rashi explains, anish b'nei adam ha'ivim advarav. You give punishments to people who don't follow your words, meaning you're a dayan, you're a reides ha'am. So you have some sort of tendency of redness in your personality. Fractal some sefer in a tshuva in our HaMeisim Kuf Tzadik Vav, she said, why didn't Abai tell him the Haragas of Zera? To tell him much better. Forget about that he's a dayan who gives punishment. He actually killed Rav Zera. Kedisa b'Gemara Megillah. Rav Zera. Rav Dusudas Purim about it. All the Yivsim come Rav Shatla Rav Zera. L'machavar Rav Achmei. Meaning v'achis. Effective sefer. What do you mean? We have on record a first Gemara of Rabbah engaging in actual murder, albeit while he's inebriated, while he's drunk. But you're looking for proof that Mazel Madam leaves a mark. You can't have better proof than that. The sefer gives an answer. It's Tzarich Leimar. Mishum Dehadar Achya Al Deit Tfilasei Leibayi Lemitli Mazel Madam. Fascinating thing. He says, since he brought him back to life through his tefillas, he later davened and brought him back to life. Abaye wasn't going to be tail of that in his redness of his personality. Why? Because Vice says, since he brought him back to life, that wasn't considered a Ritzicha. Now, the Achronim want to bring rayas from this, and maybe the Sefer is very tugishal to this, in regards to a person who kills his friend and then the guy comes back to life. Are you actually called a murderer now? Meaning, if a Ritzeach kills someone and the guy comes back to life, you called a murderer now. Now, seemingly, from this Gemara would be a raya that you're not. Now, B'l'chayra, we could also have a raya from this Gemara potentially, is that since Abaya, the way the Sefer is like framing this Gemara, since Abaya didn't look at what Rabbah did as murder, because Rabbah davened and he came back to life. So l'chayra, maybe we also don't look at that as Rav Zera actually expiring. And when Rav Zera came back, his relationships and his financial equities and everything else snaps right back into what it was. Meaning there's something lacking in this murder. Just like this murder doesn't constitute a murder, maybe it also doesn't constitute a murder Legabi all together dinim, the nafkaminas of dinim. Now, this is all, so to speak, a little bit inconclusive and wishy-washy, and I don't have a clear outcome for this. Ayin and Siman Yudzayin, the Knesset Agdol, and the Pesach Tshuva, and the Birkei Yosef, and etc. that handle the Shailah. Should the Shailah come up Negei Lamaisa, please rush over to your local Orthodox rabbi and get an answer. It's more just exploring a interesting conceptual Shailah, so to speak, in how to look at death when it's only temporary. Now, how to look at this in comparison to actual Techiyas HaMeisim Lasad Lavai, and what will be the nafkaminas then. So there is a famous tshuva from the Rasag that I like to mention over here that handles in Sefer HaPetus V'Atchiyah, he handles what's going to be when if a person was married to two wives, two different women, or a woman is married to two different husbands, who's she going to come back married to? And he says, it's not my concern to try to resolve this. Moshe Rabbeinu will be the Techiyas HaMeisim, all the Gedolim from previous days. We won't have to worry about how to answer these questions. So l'chayra, I say about this too. When Techiyas HaMeisim will come b'meheira, this won't be a concern that we'll have to decide on our own. We'll have Moshe Rabbeinu v'chal ziknei Sanhedrin v'chulu v'chulu, and I guess
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.